Now look, I want another question in this line of questioning, because this is what I think, this is my own view of what's really interesting at the moment. I don't know whether either of you agree with this. As you said, the rivers of gold. The rivers of gold were truly golden. And the rivers of gold at Fairfax allowed Fairfax to start a national financial newspaper, the Financial Review, which wasn't profitable for what, 20-something years, a long time. It did that. It allowed it to the greatest flowering of journalism ever known in the universe. The National Times was funded by the rivers of gold.
Did you have an association with that?
Oh, briefly. All of these things, but now, Fairfax is still profitable. Isn't what's happened is that newspapers have gone from being very, 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 very profitable undertakings to being merely very profitable undertakings. And that what the adjustment that is going on at the moment is not because newspapers are bankrupt or even facing bankruptcy, but because they have been dragged back into the real world of commerce, where they are merely very profitable and no longer obscenely, effortlessly profitable.
That's absolutely true.
Yep.
And the trouble with that is, of course, that because we're no longer in the hands of, there were obviously downsides, but because we're no longer in the hands of families, we're now in the hands of boards who are basically influenced by what analysts say about not the present but the future. Most of the analysts have really, firstly, maybe it's my age, but they look like kindergarten children. Make these decisions about where these great companies, media companies, are heading, and what they say in their reports has an immediate effect on the share price. And actually, the Fairfax share price, on the basis of how other shares have performed in the bull market, which is now a bear market or a half bull, half bear, I don't know what it is.
Pig market.
But a pig market, it didn't perform well at all. And one of the reasons it didn't perform well was because the analysts talked the company down.
Well, they have this dream, don't they? If you could only cut the fat, if you could only cut the fat, these places could be profitable as they once were.
Yes, which is a complete nonsense.
There's this kind of machismo, because there is a difficulty. How do you view the journalists you employ? Are they a cost or an investment? If you view them as a cost, of course, let's get rid of them. You don't need two people who understand about Indonesia in Australia. You can have one in Melbourne and he can feed the Herald. And don't send him to Jakarta or her to Jakarta because it's much too expensive. You cut the fat. And these reports pour out of stockbrokers' offices all the time. And occasionally we see them and they're just laughable. They show something about the media which makes commentators think that they don't have to have any expertise. You know, if you were advising on the prospects of a butter factory, you would have to know something about the manufacture of butter. But if you're advising on the prospects of journalism, you don't even have to know anything about journalism. You can just sort of say, cut the fat, you know, you can get rid of half those people.
Well, if you read the recent annual reports of not only Fairfax, but companies like Fairfax around the world, they say straight up that it's part of the business plan to diversify away from newspapers. So Fairfax has recently changed its name to Fairfax Media. It no longer sees itself primarily as a newspaper company, and Fred Helmer has admitted he thought that he should have flogged the things off. There's a figure, Mark Scott, who, what was the title here, gentlemen? What was his former title in Fairfax?
He was
somewhere
near the top and had a lot to do with strikes.
Somewhere near the top and had a lot to do with strikes. He, at a recent speech at the ABC, he said that the figure used within Fairfax is that for every one reader of the hard copy of the paper, you need more than 100 online to make the same amount of money. Which is the reason why the websites of The Age and the Sydney Morning Herald are both more tabloid, in inverted commas, more populist than the print copies of the edition. You have to go for a mass audience in order to hope to make money out of that realm. So I don't think these companies any longer see themselves as journalism companies, as sellers of journalism. I think.
But yet, do you think that pessimism is justified? Because, as I say, you know, circulation's going up on The Age. It's making money.
Well,
Nearly everybody in this audience buys a newspaper.
Yes, well, this audience is hardly typical, though, I have to say.
Don't be rude. This is clearly a mainstream. My favourite word. This is a mainstream Australian audience.
I'm being the reverse of rude. But the equity issues, which I mentioned earlier, are an extrapolation of a current trend. We're talking almost exclusively about broadsheet newspapers here, and most Australians, the vast majority of Australians, do not now, and have not for a long while, read a broadsheet newspaper. So if all we're going to talk about in terms of the woes of the media is broadsheet newspapers, we are talking about a tiny part of the problem.
Do you think part of the answer might be to teach young kids how to read a broadsheet newspaper on a crowded tram? It's something you grow up learning how to do. If you don't know how to do it, they might buy the Herald Sun.
I think part of the answer, and I hasten to say not the whole of it, but part of the answer may well be to get young kids to teach us what they are interested in reading.
For heaven's sake, mate, you sound like a communist. Okay, now look, let's have some questions from the audience. I don't promise that we'll shut up, but let's have some questions. Yes?
I wasn't sure this was directly on the subject, but you said it 2 or 3 times. I think the major problem with what you call a broadsheet paper is the psychological connection between broadsheet beats quality, and therefore we have to have that size of newspaper. But the reality is the size of paper I like to read is a Time magazine or bulletin or whatever. Not
You didn't have that early childhood training, did you?
Is it an issue and can it be changed?
Yes, it can be changed, of course, and,
Yes.
and Fairfax is considering changing it, changing the size of the age in the Sydney Morning Herald.
Fairfax announced it was
You've
going
seen,
to
if you have a look at the New York Times, it is half the size of our broadsheets. In fact, the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald are the biggest broadsheets in the world. So
They've nearly all contracted a bit too.
yes,
The Sun's too big to read. I mean,
the Sun.
I think the future of newspapers will be to become much more like magazines, both in content and in size. And you have to pay, you will have to pay a lot more for the sort of journalism that's been
Can you
associated
afford
with
to
it.
produce a paper? I don't know what the technology is, but they never seem
There are
to
two-
be like magazines.
Well, there are lots of problems with it. And one is that as classified advertising declines, you are more and more in the hands of display advertisers. So it's the huge ad from Marr announcing the latest sale. That's what pays for journalism. Now, I'm not quite sure why Fairfax suddenly backed away from reducing the size of its broadsheet to
I can
something.
tell you why, David.
Is it
the
because the
advertiser
advertiser
said,
Yeah.
if you reduce the size of a 4-page ad by 40%, then we want a 40% reduction.
It's called capitalist logic, and you've got to respect it in some way.
Absolutely.
And funnily enough, they hadn't worked this out before they announced to the world, it seems, that they were going to reduce the size of the papers to what I think is a beautifully elegant shape. I mean, it's sort of narrower by a column. You know, anyway, it's beautiful. But the advertisers aren't going to pay less. So the physical awkwardness of opening and dealing with this thing called a newspaper is actually what's paying for the journalism inside it. Now, the other thing, of course, is length of article. And I think one of the things we're going to be going to in future is where you get a taste of a long article in the physical newspaper, and it will say, for the full article, go to the net. And I think we'll all enjoy that, because we will, it's a way of publishing I've got to tell you that from my personal point of view, there is nothing I love more than filling with my own work a double-page spread of a broadsheet. And from time to time, that indulgence is still granted to me, and it's hugely thrilling. And but I think that that's going to become rarer and rarer.
Well, you see, I think if that happens, I think that is happening now. I mean, David gets this concession to write at great length, but very few of the other reporters on the paper write anything of. And even you, David, you're not allowed to do all that often. Tell them.
Oh no! I mean,
in fact, most of the time we're told no, you can't.
It's very
have
rare.
1,000 words and
2,000 words is huge.
But see, I think that's a big mistake. I actually think. I mean, I do read things off the net, but I am cutting down a huge number of trees to do that. I can't read a 5,000 word piece on the screen. I print it out. And so I actually think for the age of the Sydney Morning Herald, it is a mistake to go to shorter and shorter stories. I think that if you're going to do that, well, the Herald Sun and the Telly does that perfectly adequately, better, in fact, than
Short is a great skill.
Some things require short, and many of us don't have the skill to write short. I think that's true. But I absolutely think that there are times when I do want to feel like there is even if I don't read it, there's a 1,500 word news report. Yes. You have a look at, there is no way that those people who daily get the New York Times read everything in that paper. They couldn't read a quarter of what's in that paper. But it's comforting that it's there. They feel like, well, maybe I won't read it, but someone will.
It's like being in a town where there's good theatre. You might not go often, but you know it's there.
It's there. Yes. I think it is a bit like that.
Okay, in the blue, there.
I'd just like to ask all of you what do you make of the rise or so-called rise of citizen journalism and how that possibly might supplement a decline in newspaper readership or a drift towards just corporate media itself, and what that might do for... Honestly, the problem is probably that, I'm just sort of preempting that it might be actually getting that from the mass media. But what do you make of that? Is there possibilities that we can see more of that forming?
Well, I think citizen journalism and the various things that go under that tag, it's a pretty loose term, is one of the hopes of the future. Not the only hope, and there are some problems with it, of course. What we're really talking about with citizen journalism is that the idea that citizens might talk back. And I actually think that's an imperative. All the world's major media companies now understand that conversation with the audience is an imperative, it's not a choice. And so in a sense, we can't say whether citizen media is good, citizen journalism is good or bad, it's here to stay to a point. There have been a number of recent experiments, both here and overseas. Professor Jay Rosen overseas with his new assignment, .net, You Decide 2007 here in Australia. They're all gradually working their way to a similar sort of conclusion. I think I've just finished writing an article on this, which is that the future of citizen journalism is probably not a whole load of amateurs firing off at random, that the good stuff will come, if you like, from a pro-am collaboration with professional journalists with all the traditional merits of the newsroom in terms of editorial direction, focus, fact-checking, all that sort of thing, but supported by a host of very engaged amateurs who will both contribute content and respond to the content in real time as it's presented. I think that's a sustainable model in terms of providing the content. What we haven't got yet is a way of paying for it, but there are experiments going on all over the world, and particularly in the United States, with different models, and I think it will only be a matter of time before we do get one that is sustainable. Crikey, in a very small way in Australia, started that way, and is now going great guns. A profitable business, not massively profitable, but a profitable business. Subscriptions are up 30% on this time last year, so it's growing very fast. And it pays, not very well, but it pays its contributors now, which it didn't when it started out. You were asking, the difficulty is getting it into the mass media, and with respect, I would suggest that's a misconception. The future is only partly about mass media. It will also be, and the mass media will be the sort of commoditised news that I talked about earlier, instant, bite-sized, international news. The future is also about many, many niches, many, many small medias. Okay? And citizen journalism, for example, on my suburb, or my workplace, or my rock group, or whatever, will be part of the future. You may have heard of the theory of the long tail. There's a guy in America who wrote a book called The Theory of the Long Tail. What he's looking at is groups like Amazon, for example, or some of the online music stores. Now, Amazon.com makes most of its money from its least popular books. Okay, so right at the top you've got, the big, in the graph, you've got the big boom at the front, which is your big bestsellers, your Da Vinci Codes and all that sort of thing. They don't actually make most of their money there at all. They sell those books. But the tail, the books that only a few thousand or even a few hundred people are interested in, goes on and on and on and on and on. And because the internet has got rid of the problems of distribution and the physical limitations of just having to stock that many books, The tail, in the end, adds up to more than the bump at the beginning. Now, this is, I think, one of the models for the media. We will still have mass media. I'm certainly not predicting its decline, nor am I predicting the death of newspapers. I think they'll continue as well. But a lot of the future is not about mass media, it's about niche media. The challenge is making sure we still have some connections between those in some places where we still need it.
Jeff, can I just say something about what Meg said that frankly annoys me? I don't think that if the future of mass media is that it'll produce bite-sized, commoditised news, that it'll have a role at all, frankly. That can be disseminated in all sorts of ways fairly easily.
But that is media, disseminating it is media.
Well, when you say that's its future, I sort of think to myself, let me put this to you. The most expensive operation for the New York Times, or for Fairfax, in the last few years has been covering the Iraq War. The New York Times would have spent, as I said, Meg, $1.5 million a year at least on covering that war. John Burns, who's been there the whole time, is probably the most expensive. Not that he earns it, he earns it in other ways, but he's probably been the most expensive foreign correspondent in the history of US media in terms of supporting him. Paul McGowan, who has covered the war for The Age, is probably, in terms of what we've spent, what Fairfax has spent on,
hugely expensive.
Very, very expensive.
Nothing I say, Michael, is meant to say that isn't important.
But they don't produce bite-sized, commoditised news. I mean,
that's exactly my point.
So who's going to pay for that?
Well, that's exactly my point.
You mean who's going to pay for the McGows and the Burns?
Yes, who's going to pay
That is exactly my point. That I don't mean for a second to say that sort of reporting isn't worthwhile. Of course, it's incredibly worthwhile. But as you have said yourself, the business model that supports it is in decline and under threat. We have to find new ways of supporting it. And I think one of them will be people who are interested, which is a minority, sadly, having to pay much more for it. And there are real problems and concerns with that. I'm certainly not predicting some utopia here. There are real problems with that. Pro-Am will certainly be part of it, already has been, in covering the Iraq War and the events just the other week in Timor as well.
That's true.
That will certainly be part of it, and we will have to find new business models.
Can I ask you, though, about citizen journalism and the net? Aren't we faced, even more strongly now than ever, with branding? Because what do we trust out there? How do we learn to trust these things? Now, naturally, anybody of any intelligence living in Melbourne for any length of time trusts The Age. Ditto in Sydney, the Sydney Morning Herald, and all people who subscribe to Crikey do so because they trust the damn thing or are stimulated enough to do it. But how do these little niches that you're talking about out there come to be trusted and therefore come to be used, come to be visited?
Well, again, there's been a fair bit of experimentation and research on this, again, mainly in the States. A world in which almost anyone can publish their news and views to the world. In which the tools, well, it depends where you look, doesn't it? It depends where you look. In which the tools of media, if you like, are more evenly spread through society, is in a way a bit like the oral economy, the oral way of spreading news and views, which pre-existed the printing press and pre-existed even literacy. Now, how do people in an oral society where there's no written language, how do you work out who to trust them? Well, by connections, by reputation, by track record. And that is how journalists will have to be trusted in the future, which is why conversation, which is part of what we talk about when we talk about citizen journalism, is an imperative. It is, in fact, a new kind of journalism in some ways. We've had letters to the editor pages and that sort of thing before, but that has always been a heavily moderated forum. But now conversation has actually become a key journalistic skill. And one of the things that worries me is it's not taught much in journalism schools or indeed in newsrooms. I think we will learn, I mean, that question, how do you learn who to trust on the internet, is one that tends to be asked by people who don't actually use the internet very much.
Oh, I do.
In fact, it's not that hard. You learn it through track record, through recommendation, in exactly the same way that if you were pre-literate, you would learn who to trust in your immediate society.
But I call it the Wikipedia problem. You know, Wikipedia is there, and it is this wonderful resource, but you actually don't know whether you can trust individual entries in Wikipedia. But let's have some more questions from the audience, please.
Could I say that whilst I know lots of people who get classifieds off the internet, buy things off the internet, I don't know anyone of any age who gets their news off the internet, and most people don't have the time to sort through all that community and all the... You really need a journalist to give you something you can read on the tram or on the way home and get the news in a few minutes.
But yet what we know from all of the surveys is that perhaps having battled with a broadsheet on the tram, people get to work and immediately click on to the website of The Age or the Herald Sun, and then they click on again at lunchtime. And madam, I have to tell you, it is a widespread practice in the community. Of course, the ABC as well.
And
yes.
the ABC must not be forgotten in this discussion because it's very important.
And then Crikey comes through at lunchtime, and let me tell you, journalists anyway get extremely toey if Crikey hasn't come through in the lunch hour. But that is what happens, and maybe people are going out to niche websites, but we do know that they're coming to commercial, mainstream, journalistic websites to update themselves through the, I hate that word update, to tell them during the...
That's the point, you do it for us. We need journalists to do that frost sort of...
That's our job, we're like plumbers.
Nobody would argue with that.
Yeah, plumbers and electricians and journalists.
Well, where do you think just on Crikey, it's very interesting that Crikey has changed, of course, over the last couple of years from what it was when it first started to becoming a sort of a website, a news website and a commentary website that seems to have established the same sort of values and truth-telling and fact-checking to a certain extent that the so-called mainstream media has, and its circulation has grown 30%, which seems to suggest to me that that's what people want.
Trust
they don't want.
30% over 1 year.
Yes, they want to trust what.
30% over 1 year, and surveys we do also show that we have a much higher trust rating than Fairfax. I mean, it's actually a mistake to say that people trust the Herald Sun and the Age and the Sydney Morning Herald. All the surveys say people don't trust them at all.
No, that's true. That's true, but I don't believe them. Otherwise, they wouldn't buy it. I mean, what are they buying it for? But the fact is, Nick, that sort of goes against what you were saying about Crikey is a traditional media. Just delivered on his mainstream media, delivered more or less. Maybe a bit sharper.
It's more opinionated.
But if it's more opinionated and a bit sharper, then that's a failing of the newspaper.
That's right, you bet.
But before, when Crikey was a sort of rumour sheet, really, that I quite enjoyed. I mean, I never believed anything that was in it, but I enjoyed the rumours. They were always interesting.
I would say that Crikey has learnt many of the virtues of the traditional newsroom over its short life. Not that short anymore, actually, just had its 8th birthday. But, and that will continue. I think the traditional newsroom has many virtues, and we need them.
This is turning into an extended ad for Crikey. I'm going to stop it right now.
But can I just say one thing? But the key difference is conversation. It is much more interactive. I've worked for The Age, I've worked for The Australian, and I've worked for Crikey, and it is very different. Very different.